When I sent the first draft of Project Gilbert off to my editor at the end of January, I thought it was going to be about a month before I got my edits back. But because of some new editorial staff at HarperCollins, and because of a couple of other things that came up, it ended up taking a little bit longer than that. It is now, as of filming this, mid-April, and I have just gotten my edits back. Now, when I talk about edits, I know I've mentioned in videos before that there's sort of 3 levels of edits. There's the structural edit, the line edit, and then the proofread. This is actually pre-structural edits, kind of. It's like the first structural edit, I guess, but it's a little bit more generalized than that. Now, if you don't know about Project Gilbert, I started writing the first book, which we'll come to what that means in a second, back in July. And I wrote the first draft of the first book really quickly, like in 2 months. At first, I thought I was writing a standalone book, but then in the middle of that process, actually just a couple weeks into it, I had lunch with my publisher. Now, I mentioned my editor, I mentioned my publisher. Those are 2 different people. So my publisher, Charlotte, is the head honcho of One More Chapter, the list at HarperCollins that publishes me. My editor sits on that team. Now, when I first started working with One More Chapter as an author, and when I worked on the list previously when I worked at HarperCollins, it was Charlotte doing the editorial work. So I have a really good relationship with her. We are friends. And when I went up to London to have lunch with what I thought was going to be Charlotte and my editor, it ended up just being Charlotte because my editor had COVID. So we went out to lunch and I was telling her about the project, telling her about the draft I was working on, and I was feeling really conflicted about the pacing of the book because it's very much like destination based, and there's a lot of different physical destinations within the book. And I felt like with it being one book, I wasn't able to give each destination enough time to the point that it was going to feel too rushed or the locations were going to feel inconsequential. So Charlotte and I agreed that it could be an interesting idea for me to break it up into multiple books. And the second I made that decision, everything for the rest of the first book just kind of slotted into place for me. And so I wrote to what felt like a really natural breaking point in the story and what felt like a really natural conclusion to that first part of the story for that first draft. Then I sent it to my editor. She's read it. One of the new editors on the list has read it, and it looks like we're going to be turning it back into a standalone book. And the reason for that is not because it doesn't work as a multi-book series, but it's about the market. I talk a lot about how it's important to never try to write for the market. When you have an idea, and especially if you're unpublished, don't try to write because of what's popular or because of market trends. That is your agent and editor's job to worry about that. And my editor has worried about that. And it turns out from what she's saying that in the market right now, people prefer series where each book acts as a standalone. And the way that I was structuring Project Gilbert, which I was foreseeing being 2 or 3 books, they were not going to be standalones. You had to read them in order for it to make sense. Now, I was not told you have to make this one book. That's not how my editor operates. They want to publish me as an author. And I think that if I had really strongly said, no, I really want to publish this as 3 separate books, they would have let me do that. But as an author, there's a few things I have to think about here in order to make that decision. First of all, do I understand where my editor is coming from? Yes, I absolutely do. I, as a reader, prefer that as well. I've started reading a few more series lately, and I sometimes get annoyed when I feel like they move on too much from one to the next, and there's not like a good conclusion to the previous one. Because sometimes it's months between when I'm reading those and I just don't remember what happened. And so even if I have got the context of the previous ones, I like for each story to feel self-contained because that's how I'm reading it in that moment. Very rarely am I gonna like read a series all the way through. I don't like to do that typically. I also have seen this a little bit with the reviews for the summer wedding in Santorini. I worked hard to try to make sure, because I knew it had been so long since the first book came out, that you didn't have to remember every detail of the first book in order for the second book to make sense. And mostly the reviews have acknowledged that. They're like, didn't read the first one, so there were a few things that I missed out on, but I'm really enjoying it and I think that it worked well as a standalone. There are a couple people that disagree with that in the reviews, but most people who didn't read the first one said that it acted as a good standalone and they still got what they wanted out of the story, which is great. That would not be the case with Project Gilbert the way that I had started writing it. So question 1, do I see where my editor is coming from? Do I agree with the assessment there? Yes. Question number 2, do my goals for this story make it possible to change it that fundamentally? For other people, the answer to that might be no, actually. The story that I want to tell needs 3 books, and therefore that's what I want to do. For me, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. In fact, when I first had the idea for this book, I envisioned it as a single book. As well, this wasn't originally the intention, but the way that it's being sort of discussed, I think internally at HarperCollins, and language my editor used with me, is like a millennial eat, pray, love. That is one book. And like, granted, it's a memoir, but it is one book and it has multiple destinations in it. Like, I do think that it is possible to tell this story in a fulfilling and satisfying and compelling way in one book without it being 700 pages long. I think it's possible. Do I think I'll need to change a few things quite substantially? Yes. But I do think that it's possible, and I don't think that it would compromise the nature of the story and the impact of the story. It's just going to be challenging because of the way I've been thinking about it. And then question number 3 for me, which I don't think should be discounted and is a big driving factor, is how does this decision impact my relationship with my publisher? Like I said, I don't think that they would force me to do it in 1 book versus 3 books. In fact, I know they wouldn't because my editor said that. I think that if I said, no, I want to write this as 3 books, they would do that. They would publish that. However, marketing decisions and promotion decisions are made based on the return on investment they think that they can get. And if the people who are in that space, watching the market every single day and understanding the trends, think that the market is not going to receive this 3-book series well, they're not going to promote it in the same way. And I don't begrudge them that. They're going to promote the things that are going to make them money. And if me turning this book into one story is going to mean that it gets promoted and it reaches more readers, I think that's an important part of this conversation, assuming it doesn't compromise the story. And I don't think it does, as I said. My goal is to be able to tell as many stories as possible and share them with as many readers as possible. That is absolutely my goal. It's not tied up in this one specific story. It's not tied up in a specific structure. I don't need to be doing series every time. And I have so many ideas for what to work on next, such as Project Getaway, which I started on the plane to the US back in March. That idea is really strong in my mind. And actually, there is something appealing in the idea of reworking this into a single book, shipping that single book, and then getting to work on something else. I think that one of the things I saw with Summer Wedding in Santorini is that I had to work really hard to not feel sort of exhausted by the story. Like, it was a very different story, but it was the same characters, same world, same community, etc. And I had to work extra hard to make sure that I didn't get sick of it, basically. And so the idea of being able to tell this in one book and not have to sit with it for years essentially and be able to move on to the next thing faster is compelling to me. So ultimately, I think I am going to try to make Project Gilbert one book. That is going to be a hell of an edit. In fact, some might call it a rewrite, which is very annoying if you've seen previous Project Gilbert vlogs. The idea of rewriting Project Gilbert is not a new concept around here. I don't want to do it because I've already got 75,000 words written of this book, and to go back and make it first person, I'm gonna have to literally rewrite all of it. However, I think it's gonna be best, maybe not necessarily for the story. Do I think that the story would be better told over 3 books? Yes, but not to the point that it's compromising anything to condense it. So I think it's gonna be better for me as a writer. I think it's obviously going to be better for reaching more readers, and it's gonna be better for my relationship with my publisher to follow this feedback. And that is the thought process process that I would go through for any major piece of feedback that I receive. Do I see where they're coming from? Do I feel like it's super important for me to tell this story at this moment in this way? And what is the best option for my relationship with my publisher? I feel really fortunate that they do like the story. They think it's a compelling story worth telling. And honestly, I'm just excited to work with them to get it out there in whatever format is going to do best. I've got some more specific feedback now that I've made that decision coming my way in terms of how we can go about restructuring things and condensing it down into one book. So watch this space because I might go through some of those more specific edits when I get them. However, for now, I need to be doing some thinking about structure, and I need to be doing some thinking about pacing because I want to make sure that my original concerns about the pacing being rushed or the locations being rushed doesn't come into play here. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing in order to achieve that is I'm going to be trying to read books that have really tight pacing and where scenes are achieving lots of different things and there's a really good economy of words. Over the last few months, I've been really interested, especially in the romance novels that I'm reading, in looking at like which scenes and which moments authors choose to include in the story. And like, that's very fundamental to storytelling, but I'm noticing it in the books I'm reading in a way that I haven't before. And I think as much as I've rebelled against the idea of plotting for Project Gilbert, I think I'm gonna have to in order to condense this story down quite a lot. So there's gonna be some significant process changes that come with this. So like I said, watch this space. If you're not already, be sure to hit subscribe so that you can see how I approach these changes and what are the structural decisions that I make in order to facilitate this. I'm gonna try to be as open as possible because I am definitely not the only person to have gotten feedback like this, and if you're working on a project as well, it's useful to understand how to create that economy of words, how to condense things, and I can't wait for us to discover that together. Let me know in the comments if you've got any recommendations for books I should be reading in my research, and otherwise I will catch you next time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.